This is Rick Sanchez reporting with a special segment that we are bringing you tonight. The embassy latest, as there appears to be a takeover at the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C. These are the pictures as they appear right now. This is a residence just outside of Georgetown, not far from the Capitol and the White House, where it appears tonight that at the behest of the Trump administration, Secret Service police in Washington, D.C. have gone into this building. They came with wire cutters, opened the front door, eventually waited some time, then came back and removed from here the 2 or 3 people who are Maduro supporters who were inside this building. What you hear from the outside, by the way, are the Juan Guaido supporters who are just outside the building itself. Let me show you some of the video now that we got from a little bit earlier as we saw the police. I don't know, Kevin, if you have that. I was about to call for that before we started. Okay, here it is now. These are the police about 30 minutes ago when we watched as they came in, and for the first time, to the cheers of the Guaido supporters, who, as you know, is the self-proclaimed or the opposition leader backed by the United States president, taking on Maduro. Those are his supporters that are screaming, that have been calling for Secret Service police to go in there and do what you see them doing there right now. And finally, they did just that, removing the handful of Maduro supporters, many of them with code pink, who had basically been squatting inside this embassy residence, if I can use that term. You can see in the background there some of the people who were still inside that building. And now we're going to be going back live to the actual scene now outside. I don't know, there may have been somebody in front there. So you hear the people screaming now, Guaido, Guaido. We're going to have a couple of things for you as we follow this breaking news. Michele Greenstein is going to be on the scene reporting for us live. We're also going to be joined by award-winning investigative journalist Max Blumenthal, who is the author of The Management of Savagery, who has also just returned from Venezuela and has done extensive reporting on the Venezuelan crisis. Just before we went off the air here, around 8:25, we got word that the Secret Service police were actually going to be going into the building. Now, mind you, they have been asking for some of the Maduro supporters who were inside the Venezuelan embassy for some time now to leave the premises, but they had failed to do so. All this while they've been screamed at in perpetuity, it seems, by the Guaido factions who've been outside of this building. And then finally, we finally see as the Secret Service police came in here. Now, as we set this story up, I should kind of give you the background. And I think part of the reason that this story has gotten so much import and will likely get even more attention now is this is not just a story about a residence and a diplomatic residence in Washington, D.C. This story will likely affect and will probably affect the United States in terms of blowback, because if you think about it, the current president of Venezuela, at least according to what their elections held, is Maduro. Like him or not, and there's plenty of people who don't, Maduro is the elected president of Venezuela. Usually, the head of state of a country chooses who resides in his diplomatic mission or embassy interest section in another country. Well, in this case, the United States is telling the Maduro government, no, sorry, we are going to decide who goes in this building, and we've decided that Juan Guaido, the person we favor, gets to decide who goes in there. And that's why Guaido has chosen Mr. Vecchio to be his chief diplomat of his administration, supported by the United States, and Mr. Tare as well. Gang in Washington, let me know if we have Max Blumenthal so we can bring him in. to see if we can get some reaction. Max, I don't know if you've been watching this play out for the better part of the last half hour to 45 minutes or so, but if you would, give us your take on this situation as it's been playing out.
Well, I've been watching it play out, Rick, for the past several weeks, actually for over a month. And this is a really unique situation where you have the U.S. government actually recognizing a non-existent government and handing over the sovereign embassy of the real government to that non-existent government. This has international legal implications. It's a violation of the Vienna Convention's Article 22, which holds that countries must maintain each other's embassies even during periods of war. And it also helps kind of set the stage for war if the playtime ambassador, Carlos Vecchio, is able to actually get a foothold in this embassy, because today, Vecchio, on fake letterhead, pretending to be the government of Venezuela, issued a letter to Southcom, the U.S. Southern Command of the U.S. Navy, appealing for military assistance. And this really shows what his agenda is, which is to use that embassy as a lobbying shop for war. And this is what the embassy protectors have been standing against. I know that 3 of them have just left, including the 2 embedded journalists, and 4 embassy protectors are still inside and are willing to get arrested because they realize that they are standing against an act of war. And if the U.S. treads on this embassy, which is sovereign Venezuelan territory under international law, it is an act of war that could potentially be reciprocated against.
Well, Max, let's consider this, because we're looking at live pictures now. I don't know if you can see it on your screen. Yeah. Max Blumenthal joining us by phone. It looks like maybe the argument that they're going to make, certainly from the standpoint of these Secret Service police officers, possibly from the Trump administration, is that, look, we're just going to be neutral on this thing. We're going to lock these doors. We're not going to let the Guaido guys in. We're going to kick out the Maduro people, and we're just going to shut this thing down. We don't think that the Maduro government deserves or should have an embassy, because we don't have diplomatic relations with them right now. So we're just not going to let anybody reside in this building. Do you think that might be the case, and what would be your reaction to that?
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that scenario, Rick. I was just listening on the live stream to a speech by one of the fanatics outside who has been hectoring embassy protectors with violent tirades. And she referred to them as terrorists, but she also said that we don't know when we can get the embassy back in our hands. We have to see what the terrorists have done. So there is some anticipation.
Max, I'm just going to have to interrupt you. Look at these pictures now on the screen. It appears that they've locked the door, but the pro-Maduro representatives or activists are still in the building. That's them. Yeah. That's them out looking out the window. Do you know any of these people? Can you tell us anything about them?
I do. Well, let me just address the scenario. One scenario that could play out is that we will see another country which is friendly with Venezuela and which does have relations with the West take custody of this embassy. And this would allow Switzerland to take over the U.S. embassy in Venezuela, which would be a peaceful resolution that would help de-escalate this conflict. And that is precisely what the embassy protectors want, and it would be a massive defeat. It would possibly be the nail in the coffin to Juan Guaido's coup. And so that may be what we're witnessing now, with the doors being locked again and these others remaining inside, not being arrested. We have Kevin Zeese and Margaret Flowers, who helped start Occupy D.C. back in 2011, and they're from Popular Resistance, still inside. These are veteran activists. And I know that there are Adrian Pine inside, who is a expert on Latin America and the situation very well. And I know that there are 2 others, and these are very brave individuals who understand the ins and outs of international law and have a clear agenda, which is to de-escalate this situation. I can also tell you, Rick, that I've had conversations with a number of people from the neighborhood. This is in Georgetown, including people who live at the building next door, and they are furious, absolutely furious at the atmosphere of intimidation that they've witnessed every day, and having to feel like they themselves are under threat. And I've witnessed having been down at the embassy many times, this crowd outside attacked black people with racist tirades, attacked gay people with homophobic tirades, make motions that they were going to kill the people inside, and constantly blaring sirens and air horns day in and day out. So this is a situation that the Secret Service and D.C. police allowed to manifest and metastasize, and it's really, hopefully, the end of that situation for everyone.
Yeah, well, it's, you make a great point. It's always difficult for somebody living in an area like this. They're probably thinking, look, this is not my issue, it's your issue, and how dare you come into my neighborhood, no matter what your position is, and keep me and my children and my family up at night with your protestation. So one can understand that.
It's a lot like the Guarimbas in Venezuela, which disrupted the lives of average Venezuelans and even killed them. And so this is actually a metaphor for what's been happening to Venezuela, and the true agenda and the true face of the opposition has really been shown through this activism that took place.
Well, it's interesting, the point that you made about possibly the Swiss coming in here and creating a neutral residence. Now, there is a historical anecdote, or a historical footnote, I should say, to this. The Cuban embassy in the United States for many, many years was actually the Swiss embassy, and instead of calling it an embassy, what they did is they partitioned part of the building and gave it to the Cuban government, the Castro government at the time, which is what was called the Cuban interest section, which is a different nomenclature, but essentially for the same thing. And something like that is what Max Blumenthal is pointing out could possibly happen in a case like this, and that's kind of a government-to-government scenario. Max, give me some closing thoughts, and I'm going to be bringing in Jim Jatras after you.
Well, just on that point, it would not be Switzerland coming in. It would be Switzerland taking the U.S. Embassy in Venezuela. Switzerland, unfortunately, despite its claim to neutrality, has recognized Juan Guaido, which was a big mistake. But it would be another country. I can't say for sure which country it is, but it would be a great resolution. And Carlos Vecchio, the fake ambassador, has no power to issue passports. So right now, Venezuelans, if they want their visas renewed or their passports fixed, they have to go to the Venezuelan interest section at the Canadian embassy. So this is just a tragedy for all Venezuelans, and I know that they are not represented entirely by this rabid crowd outside.
Max Blumenthal, we thank you for your commentary and your expertise on this particular subject. For those of you who are just now joining us, you're watching live breaking news coverage of the siege of the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C. Now we see some of the Guaido supporters just outside the Venezuelan embassy. What has been going on is really quite perplexing at this point, because the Secret Service police came in and essentially cut the wires, entered the building, but then they came back and they shut it down. And after they had shut it down, we were thinking they had removed all of the occupants from the building, but it turns out they did not. They relocked the building with the occupants still inside. We got. I just heard Michele Greenstein. We've got Michele Greenstein outside. We've got Jim Jatras by phone standing by. Let's start with Michele if we can. I just heard her voice. Michele, are you there? Can you bring us up to date on what you're seeing?
Hi, Rick. I'm outside of the Venezuelan embassy in Georgetown, Washington, D.C. Now, as you can see and hear behind me, the Secret Service have now entered the building. As of this morning, the federal authorities posted a notice on the front door saying that anyone inside the embassy was trespassing, and that they recognize, the U.S. government recognizes the government of Mr. Juan Guaido, opposition leader from Venezuela, as the president. So they posted that trespassing notice and recognized the opposition leader as the president, like they've been doing. And the opposition's ambassadors, so-called ambassadors, said that anyone who refuses to comply with this order would be arrested. Now, according to the Embassy Protection Collective, via their posts on social media from earlier today, they are all out of this embassy as of today. And just for background, basically, the U.S. State Department on April 24th said that anyone who is representing the government of Nicolas Maduro who remained in this embassy would be trespassing. But something interesting, of course, as you know, happened on that day, which is that the activists who supported Nicolas Maduro did not leave. They saw this as an illegal takeover of Venezuelan sovereign soil by both international and Venezuelan law, and they said that they would be here to defend Venezuelan sovereignty. Now, they've been staying in this embassy, living here up until today. Up until a couple days ago, they had full power as well as access to water, but as you know, U.S. authorities did cut that recently. Now, I'm staying here, seeing what will happen, what might unfold. It looks like no one is coming out of the embassy right now, but on both sides, we have protesters very loudly either showing support for Nicolas Maduro, claiming that the U.S. government is illegally trespassing, and also we have supporters of the U.S. government and the U.S.-backed opposition leader Juan Guaido declaring that the trespassers who were inside were the ones violating international law. And I'll kick it back to you.
All right, thanks so much, Michele Greenstein, doing yeoman's work. She hustled to get over there so she can bring us the latest after really doing double duty today. We're standing by here. This is a special edition of the News with Rick Sanchez as we continue to bring you the very latest of what's going on and what appears to be the siege of the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C. Joining us now by phone is former U.S. diplomat Jim Jatras to try and make sense of this situation, because we're kind of been we've been scratching our heads, Jim, trying to figure out how this thing could end up at this point.
Well, Rick, if you want me to make sense of it, that's a pretty tall order, because I don't see a whole lot of sense in what's going on here. Look, I think there are a couple of issues here. One is you asked the question, why do this now? And I think there's probably an element of pique of disappointment, of humiliation about the failed coup a few weeks ago. They can't take control in Caracas, but this they can do. So this is some place where they can say, aha, see, our recognition of Guaido as president rather than Maduro is now effective. I think there's a certain pettiness to that, of course.
Well, you know, it's funny because they actually, I don't know, and maybe I failed to report this. I should have. I think Michele may have mentioned it. The police did come out a while ago, and they read on several occasions the eviction notice to the crowd, letting all the Guaido supporters know that they were kicking out the Maduro supporters who were inside. But then, in the end, something happened which is quite inexplicable, and that is that they didn't kick out the people who were in the building. They locked the doors and left them inside. Is it because they don't want a confrontation? How's this going to end up?
Again, Rick, I don't know the answer to that question. It could be simply incompetence in the way that they're conducting their task. One would think if you're going to clear out a building of people you regard as trespassers, you would actually clear the people out of the building. But evidently they didn't do that and then lock the door afterward. That makes no sense. Look, the thing is here, Rick, is under the rules of the international order, the Vienna Convention and so forth, a country can break relations with another country. I don't think that's a good idea to do that. That's the kind of thing you do when you're about to go to war, and maybe we're going to have a war. I hope not. But for example, when we closed the Iranian embassy in 1980, we didn't turn it over to the MEK or some other group. We said, oh, they really represent the Iranian people. The embassy is sitting there closed still, basically in trust for the Iranian government till such time as diplomatic relations are restored. Why this need to turn it over to a bunch of people that honestly do not represent any ruling authority in Venezuela?
Well, what if they're not turning it over to the other people? They're just trying to kick these people out and do what you said. Just leave it empty, keep it neutral. And now these people aren't leaving, and they're not going to kick them out because they don't want to create the optics worldwide of agents representing the Trump administration kicking people out of a building by force.
I think they put themselves into that situation. Yes, and maybe part of that was because their intention was to turn it over to somebody else, that there was not an orderly evacuation of the building by the Venezuelan diplomatic personnel, that private persons became involved. It turned into basically a mess that it didn't have to, based on the wrong-headedness of the policy in the first place.
It does seem, I don't know if it's a mess, but it does seem kind of hard to put your finger on at this point exactly who's in charge and what they're doing. Jim, hold on for just a minute. I want to go back to Michele to give us a sense for what's going on the ground there. She's been talking with protesters from both sides, and she joins us once again live. Michele, can you hear me? Michele Greenstein outside with the crowd. I think they're trying to communicate with Michele now. I don't know if you can hear what I'm hearing, but certainly a lot of people in the crowd there representing both sides, and little Michele Greenstein stuck in between them. Take it away, Michele, you're on.
We got aggressiveness on both sides. There's a lot of yelling back and forth. Some of the pro-embassy protection collective supporters are yelling that the spirit of Hugo Chavez lives on. And of course, up until just a few seconds ago, we had intense chants of Guaido, Guaido, Guaido. People who are still in the embassy, correction from earlier, there are still embassy protection collective supporters in the building. We see them outside right now holding up signs. And then we also have a number of people on this side of the street holding up middle fingers to those activists.
Joe Ricci in the control room, could you do me a favor? I know Michele can't hear me. Would you ask her how they've been able to keep these two sides apart? And if she could, maybe she could talk to some of the people around her real quick to get their perspective. We'll wait.
She said, how do they separate the two groups?
Is Rick asking me, like, what?
Go ahead, Michele.
As of right now, it does not seem like the two groups are separated. We have people right behind me yelling at each other. It doesn't seem like the Secret Service, if they did try, they might have, but they were not successful in separating the pro-Maduro supporters and the pro-Guaido supporters. However, the vast majority of people around me on this side of the street are definitely in support of U.S.-backed opposition leader Juan Guaido, and they are yelling a lot of things at the Embassy Protection Collective, who remain in this building right now, holding up peace signs, as you can see.
Good reporting, Michele. We thank you. Michele Greenstein on there. She hustled to get to the scene to bring us what the situation looks like there on the ground. So let me set the scene for you again. This is Rick Sanchez with an extended News with Rick Sanchez broadcast tonight, because just as we were going off the air, we realized that there was something going on at the Venezuelan embassy. That's when we saw Secret Service police. We were told that they were going to go in and shut down the embassy and take the people who were inside out. At some point, we actually had come to the conclusion that that's exactly what had occurred. But then when we looked a little closer during my conversation with Max Blumenthal, we realized that some of these folks, some of these pro-Maduro supporters, you see them right there with the fists, are still in the building. We're told some of them may be journalists, others are supporters. All this while the Guaido supporters are outside screaming at them with the police in between. Beyond what takes place here in this residence, there's also the international implications. And that's where we bring in my next guest, Jim Jatras, who's been trying to explain to us that this thing could get even messier still. How so, Jim?
Well, I think part of it has to do with whether or not, and you talk about the optics, they don't want to be seen as roughing people up. Remember, these are, as far as I know, mostly American citizens who are in here, and they believe they're protecting the legitimate property of the actual Venezuelan government, not somebody that we have sort of pulled out of a hat. And if they are seen roughing them up in front of the news cameras, and I do have to wonder, Rick, how will this be covered by the mainstream American media? Will they actually show the American people what's going on if these people are roughed up in the process? So we've heard about Secret Service. I don't know if there are D.C. police involved. Who exactly is in charge of this operation?
Well, I can only speak for what we've been doing, and to say that as we understand it, most of our colleagues in the media, at least the U.S. media, have not been covering this story. Jim Jatras, we thank you for your commentary and your experience on this. We're down to about 3 minutes in our coverage here as we expect to sign off. There you see some of the folks inside waving peace signs and clenched fists. Again, those are the stubborn Maduro squatters who are inside the building and essentially told the Secret Service police, no, we're not going to leave. We're going to stay here. And it appears that the Secret Service police have made a decision that they're that they're not going to remove them by force, at least for now. My colleague, RT correspondent Dan Cohen, joining us now as well to bring us up to date. Dan, as you know, has been covering the Venezuela story for months now. Dan, take it away.
Well, Rick, there's a lot of uncertainty about what exactly is going to happen. I believe 3 of the people who were inside the embassy, who've been in there for about 3 weeks now, have left the grounds. They've left the premises. They're left safely without any harm or confrontation or arrest. And there are still, I don't know how many, but a handful of people inside who are choosing not to leave at this time. Now, the police put a sign on the door, a notice on the door of the embassy saying that it is illegal for them to be there. So it's not clear what authority whoever put the sign has. I mean, it was not on any kind of legal letterhead. It wasn't even signed, and it appeared that it was simply just a typed-up letter. So what happens now is it's really not clear. There are, international repercussions for if the embassy is actually taken by Carlos Vecchio and the representatives of Juan Guaido. They don't actually answer to any foreign ministry, though Vecchio calls himself an ambassador. So what would happen, the major question is, what would happen if Vecchio takes this embassy and the U.S. evicts the people living inside? What would happen in Venezuela? The Venezuelan government, in turn, take over the U.S. embassy, and what would that lead to? Could that lead to a standoff, any kind of confrontation, anything in the legal realm?
Secretary of State, and we must, we've got to add, Dan, I mean, this has got to be a scene. We're covering this live. I'm sure some others are as well. And Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is likely watching what is going on. John Bolton is likely watching what is going on. And at some point, somebody at the White House is going to have to either pull the plug, step away, or decide that they're going to send in, at the request of the administration, Secret Service police to remove these people. And that's when the real repercussions, that's when the real effect of this will be seen. We want to thank our correspondents, Michele Greenstein and Dan Cohen, for doing yeoman's work and getting to the scene and following up on this. We also want to thank our guests, Max Blumenthal and Jim Jatras. This has been a special edition of the News with Rick Sanchez on RT America, the siege of the Venezuelan embassy. We'll look for you again here tomorrow. We'll see you then.